Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about Berlin 1945 from NAC Wargames in Spain. This is a game I purchased a couple of months ago. One I was really interested in. I wanted a downfall fall of Berlin type game, but I wanted something that wasn't going to take me 20 hours to play. Very complicated. I wanted something to just kind of scratch that itch that I could play in a couple of hours and have a bit of fun with. This game particularly appealed to me for that purpose. I quite like some of the games that NAC are bringing to the fore, some of the periods they're covering. Mechanics looked interesting, the components looked interesting. Please have a look at my unboxing video of the game because that will show you some of that, which I'm going to show you in a moment with a little bit of an overview of some of the mechanics and how a turn plays out. But in principle, what you've got is a map with quadrants around the city of Berlin, and as the Soviet player you're trying to get to the internal Mitte area and ultimately to the Reichstag and capture the Reichstag. So you do that by basically defeating the Germans and getting a greater number of troops into that Reichstag area before the end of turn 12, so you can claim complete victory. For the German player, obviously you're trying to stop the Soviets from doing that, and it is a really tough crack, I feel, for the Germans, but in the game we played, my colleague who played the Soviets said that it was the time that was the killer for the Soviets. It was, could they get their victory objectives achieved before the end of that turn 12? And I suppose that kind of represents in real life probably the speed, the demand Stalin put on Zhukov and his subordinates to get Berlin captured before the Americans and the British came into Berlin. You know, there was a lot of political side as well as revenge for what had happened in the East earlier in the war. So the game captures that flavour of the for the Soviets, that kind of time pressure, being quite restricted to some degree to what you can do because you've got big lumbering armies, you've got limited order capacity. For the Germans, that is the fear of always being outnumbered. You're going to lose most battles that you fight. It's just quite a claustrophobic feel as you're gradually getting pinned further and further back until the final kind of plays out at and around the Mitte and the Reichstag. But there's some very interesting elements to the game. I like the card play. That really does add a lot of flavour without killing the game, because you have a very limited finite number of cards you can use. There's very little dice involvement at all, so again it keeps it simple. The counters themselves are really good quality, very little information on them that you need for game purposes. It's more cosmetic, and it looks really nice. The combat system is very, very simple. You speed through turns very, very quickly, and I think as on the box it says the game can be played in an hour. I think potentially it could be, once you're very comfortable with what you're doing. Our game took us about 2 hours, but that was a learning game, setting up everything else. But once we got going, those turns really did rocket through, particularly as you get in the later stages. And certainly as the German player, you're very limited to what you can do anyway, unless you're having a very good game. So I'm just going to show you just a little overview of some of the mechanics, and then we'll come back and wrap things up from there. Well, I wanted to just show you some of the key mechanics in the game, just to show you how they work in practice, and then I'll summarise my thoughts. So I just wanted to zoom in and show you a typical example. Obviously there'll be a lot more counters around here, but I just wanted to show you this particular example. So at the moment in Tempelhof, with the Russians or Soviets have captured section 6. That's now under Soviet control. They're now planning to break into the next inner circle, in this case Tiergarten, which at the moment has got a unit of Wehrmacht, SS and the flak tower. The zoo is already in place, and they've also got some barricades, so quite a tough nut to crack, but they've got 6 armies there potentially that they can attack with. However, to their flank in an adjoining sector, in number 11, Treptow, you've got 3 more German Wehrmacht units as well. So I just wanted to show you very simplified how some of the mechanics in the game work. So let's talk a little bit about a game turn. So the first thing that would happen in a game turn is each player would draw in the middle of the game 1 card. At the beginning of the game, the Soviets draw 5 and then 1 at the beginning of the turn 1, and then the Germans will draw their 5 once everything's set up, and then draw 1 at the beginning of turn 1. So you start with 6, but you only get 1 card a turn, so you're never going to get all the cards in your deck, which means that every game is going to be different because you won't always pull out everything that you want, which is exactly what happened to me playing as the German player in my first game last week. So let's show you potentially what cards the Soviet player now has in his hands. So he's pulled out a combat card, which is the C for use in combat, the Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, which will give him a +2 combat strength. So that's a good card he can use for his assault potentially. He can use only 1 card in combat, so that will probably be the one he'll use. This one is a movement card, the M. You also get ones with exclamation marks on, which are used as per the event on the card. But this one, during the Russian or Soviet movement phase, the Aleutian 2 aircraft attacks allows you to remove 1 Wehrmacht unit from any zone of your choice. So this could be very useful. It can't be used against section 5 of the MITI unless there are more than 3 units in it. But again, thinking about combining cards to maximize impact on the assault, they're 2 very useful cards. So we'll come back to those in a moment. In terms of the German player in this scenario, he's got, again, I've kept this very simple, but just to give you a flavour, he has a combat card he can use during combat, any combats. Fallschirmjägers gives +1. And he's also got, again, a movement card, which is what he's hoping to do is reinforce this time. You getting the Charlemagne battalion at the end of his movement phase deployed into any zone under his control. So he's trying to second guess what the Soviet player is going to do in his hidden orders, which will come on in a moment, and potentially add some extra strength into the Tiergarten area. So that's the card draw phase. Then we move over to Soviet planning phase, and you have this lovely hidden screen here as the Soviet player, and you can start to put counters down, orders for the sectors on the board. As you can see, the different sector numbers, for example 9, 10. So you would go along here and you would find 10 and you would find 9, and you could either move all the units, some of the units, and you can allocate the destinations that they're going to go to. So the Soviet player has to do this before the German move. This is completely hidden. The Soviet player only has potentially three activations a turn. So to cover from where it deploys around the edges of this board on these red entry points, it's got a lot of ground to take in only 12 turns. So it's a very tight time scale for the Soviets. Hidden orders are really cool. And what he might have to do is burn extra cards. He can burn 2 cards in a turn to buy himself an extra order. which could be quite useful at certain points of the game. But cards are a very, very finite resource, as you find out as you get later into the game, and I did as well. So it's easy to burn cards very, very quickly. So you've got to think very carefully about what you want to do with that. Likewise, you can use cards to replace, bring back units that have come off. That's probably going to be more relevant, I would say, for the German player, because the Soviets have a lot of eyes. So that would be the planning phase. So in this case, the Soviet will be planning to move from Tempelhof into Tiergarten, smashing his way through using his cards there to really maximise the impact. Then it's over to the German player's movement phase first. So the German player, he's now got a couple of things to think about, because he can, for his moves, he can do 4 moves a turn until the Soviets start to move into these inner circles, when he will lose orders and become harder for him to maneuver and do things. But he has more than the Soviets to start with, so he can do a number of things. He could do an advance order, which is move forward troops. He could do a withdrawal, or which is move troops out of an uncontested zone back, and he can do that. He could do a retreat. So if he was in combat here, he could retreat all his units but one back, but he'd have to leave a unit in there. So he's got a number of orders he can think about in terms of the way he decides to maneuver from that point of view. So that's something again to think about when you're doing your planning from that point of view. You can only do a certain number, which I'm just looking for, of, I believe it's withdrawals. As the German player, I believe you can only do 2 in a turn. Forgive me if I've got that wrong, because I can't find it at the moment, but I'm pretty sure it was withdrawals rather than retreats. You could only do 2 in a turn. Okay. Likewise, the German player, or any player, can do a flanking maneuver, which is to move in sideways into one of the adjoining sectors. Now, this could be, if the German player decided to take the initiative, he could potentially advance all of these into here and advance out of Tiergarten into there and try and recapture this, catching the Soviet player completely off guard. Now, the benefit of that is that the German moves come first. Now, if the German moves interfere with the Soviet plans, remember we talked about that, in this case, the Soviet plan was to advance into Tiergarten, then that order would be cancelled and they wouldn't be able to do that. So that's a really key mechanic in the game, that the Germans can do lots of spoiling attacks to negate the Soviet orders. And that's something I only sort of picked up very late in the game, when it frankly was a bit too late, but a really interesting dynamic to the game. Really like that. But let's assume that's not the case. The German player thinks, right, I'm gonna leave those chaps there. I think the Soviet player is likely to build up his strength first before he attacks. What I'm going to do is actually move 2 of these units back into here, into Kreuzberg, and start to sort of build up my defences in the inner circle. But I'll leave one there as a delaying action for any units coming in from these other areas. Okay, let's keep it really simple. So let's assume that he hasn't interfered with the Soviets' order. The Soviet player thinks, yeah, the Germans are on the hop here. We've got them. Right, we're going in. We're going to go in there and smash these units up. But before that, I did forget, at the end of the German movement phase, of course, they are going to bring in the Charlemagne unit, and what they're going to do is put that in Tiergarten, anticipating the attack from the Soviets. So suddenly that looks a little bit more interesting in there, but the Soviets still feel pretty comfortable because they've got this great cards and things. And of course, part of their movement now, they can play the Aleutian card and remove a German unit. So those cards are burned, and they decide to take off that one in the Tiergarten, so now suddenly their odds are looking far better from their point of view. Okay, so let's assume all the other movements have taken place for the Soviets, and we're then into the combat phase. So this is determined, the combats are determined in order by the German player. Okay, but in this case we're just demonstrating one combat. So combat is a diceless system, and pretty much a diceless system. I'll explain why in a moment, but it's very, very basic, very simple, simplified. So what you're doing is you're first of all going to look at playing cards. Now the German player, interestingly, has to play any cards first. So the Soviet player can sort of already be thinking about his own cards and what he needs to do or not do if the German player plays something. So the German player says, right, popping in the Fallschirmjäger here to give me a +1. So the Soviet player is now thinking +1 on top of these things, that could be a bit iffy. So he plays his expected Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, which puts him in a much stronger place. Now we determine the overall strength. So armies, standard armies are worth 1 strength point. So the Soviets have 6, +2 is 8. The Germans have 2 SS units which are worth 2 points each, so they are 4, +1 for the Fallschirmjäger is 5, and then you've also got the flak tower there, which would give another +1. I'm going to deal with barricades differently, separately to this little combat, because actually that would have impacted this a little bit beforehand. So forget the barricades for now. I'll just explain what they do in a moment. But let's assume then that is 8 plays a total of 6. So the Soviet player has 1. Now the Soviet player has won by more than 1 but has not doubled, so therefore the German player would lose 1 unit. The Soviet players, because it's not double or more, and they haven't killed in effect 2 of the units, do not take any casualties. If they had doubled or even tripled, and if they'd done 2 or 3 casualties on the Germans, they would then roll for potential casualties, and they'd roll a d10 dice if the losers lost 2 units, 2 d10s if the losers lost 3 dice, and on a roll of 1 to 3 they would also lose units. So this is a tough crack, because as it stands the area is still disputed, but the Soviets definitely have the upper hand going into the next turn. Okay, now just to cover off barriers, let's go back over here again. So if the Germans wanted, if the Russians wanted to go into an area with a barricade, they would have to roll a d10, and they would half the value rounded down, and that would be the number of units that they could actually move into the Tiergarten. So if, for example, they had rolled an 8, they would have only been able to move 4 units in, which would have then made that battle a draw. And on a draw, both sides would have lost 1 army. So barricades really useful for the Germans if they can get them there. They're only brought into play, as are the flak towers, by a card. If you don't get the card, you don't get them. But barricades really useful. They are lost if that area goes under Soviet control. They're taken off the table, whereas the flak towers will stay there forever. The flak towers, as well as providing that little bonus, they also protect that area against air raids as well. So just a useful little dynamic there. But hopefully that's just given you a very little overview, look at how some of those mechanics work. Yeah, I'll just sort of sum up my thoughts, talk a bit about my own experience of the game, and we'll wind things up from there. So hopefully that's given you a nice flavour, a nice insight into some of the key elements of the game. What was my experience? Well, we had our first learning game the other evening. I played the German defenders. Mike, my friend, played the Soviets. It took us about 2 hours, but again we were learning the game, thinking about things, although I'd say the last 4 or 5 turns were very, very quick, so I can see how that game will speed along. I would say I made a lot of early mistakes purely because I was learning the game. When I deployed at the beginning, I tried not to cover everywhere. I took the view that I needed to have some stronger points with more forces in. That was a mistake, I think, early on. The Soviets were able to launch and push into areas quicker, which then put me on the back foot. And I couldn't win many battles even with those bigger forces anyway without burning lots of cards, which I'll come on to in a moment. So I think as the German player, you've got to spread yourself thin, as obviously historically it was, and then try and pull back and bring forces together in those tighter areas, particularly as you get into the closer confines of the Mitt, where you've got very strict stacking limits which restrict the Soviets getting that weight of numbers against you, and actually that plays into the German favour a little bit more, particularly if you've got some good cards in reserve to use in those final stages of the game. For me, I think by about turn 9, 8, 9, it was pretty evident the Germans were not going to succeed in stopping the Soviets getting to the Reichstag. It was just a matter of time. However, I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't until right at the end of turn 12 in the final phase that the Soviets achieved their victory condition. So the Germans are very dogged once they're hemmed into that area, and the more units you can protect and reserve for that final assault will buy you time, and it's all about buying time. There's this kind of, as a German player, this kind of helplessness, this senselessness of the whole thing, which really to me resonates with what this battle was about. You know, I'm reading Anthony Beevor's Berlin book at the moment, which is a really good read. It's a hard read, and it was just so fruitless. This whole battle didn't need to happen, and the loss of life, you know, was extreme. So I think the game really does capture that that feeling of, we're on hiding to nothing here. What are we doing? You know, it's just preservation. It's just buying time, and ultimately the outcome is going to be the same. And that's how it felt for me. So a Soviet win. As I say, I think if I'd played some of my earlier tactics better, maybe I could have scraped out a bit more of a draw. The card mechanic was really interesting. Again, I not really realising that I was only going to get 1 card a turn. I burned, in the first couple of turns, I burned through quite a few cards, which won me some initial successes, but it really put me on the back foot later on. And what put me on the back foot even more was that I didn't get the Flak Towers card until those areas had already been overrun by the Soviets. I got the Barricades card very late in the game when it wasn't really that effective. If I'd have picked those cards out sooner, I think I'd have had a better defensive line to hold him back with. But hey, you know, that's the great thing of this game with the card mechanic. You're never going to get all the cards you want. You're going to get different cards in every game. Every game will play out slightly differently. So I think there's some longevity, some repeat playability here, definitely. And I say, I think it's a fun game. Hour and a half. I think an hour and a half is probably going to be about the sweet spot for this game in terms of time, but it's something you could fit in a couple of games in an evening, or a very slow, drawn out, just a relaxed game with a friend. Just have a chat around a couple of turns. You know, it's a nice game. Great production values. This one will be a permanent fixture on my shelf, and I'm sure one that will come out quite a lot in the future. So well done to NAC Wargames. I think this is a great addition to their library of games. I'm looking forward to seeing what else they bring out in the future. But I hope you've enjoyed this overview, my feelings review on Berlin 1945. Look forward to seeing you soon.